Hello, it's Heidi Fisher here with the Social Enterprise Online Festival, and today I'm joined by Adrian and Tim, who are going to be talking to us about social value and social return on investment. Adrian, could you tell us a little bit about your background and experience, please?
Certainly. So I fell into the world of social value and social impact reporting in the early noughties. So around the time when there was a national programme coming with encouragement from the government, being led by the New Economics Foundation, called Prove and Improve. But at the time, there were a number of sector bodies who were starting to think about how do we best prove the value and impact of our respective social enterprise model. So I ended up doing quite a bit of work with Cooperatives UK and Social Firms England on their respective toolkits for how those models of social enterprise prove their value and worthiness. And then it just kind of evolved from that. So it ended up doing various odd dances and dalliances with NEF around social return on investment. Also then got involved with Supporters Direct about building the value framework, so how supporters, trusts and fan-owned football clubs can report and record their value to the community. And then it got me thinking about myself as a freelancer, and if I do all this work and say that capturing our value, understanding our impact is important, I should probably do it on myself. So over the last 12 years, I've also been quietly but publicly developing an impact reporting framework or a value reporting framework for freelancers, which goes out every year.
Okay, thank you. And this is obviously your second interview, because you've already done one around the confusion about legal structures. So you must either like being interviews or you've got lots to share.
No, he likes the sound of his own voice, Heidi, that's the problem.
Probably. So,
this will be the second or the first, depending which order you watch them in. I think it's probably more of a reflection that I have more time on my hands than I know how to otherwise gainfully use.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for that introduction, Adrian. Tim, could you tell us a little bit about you, please?
Yeah, sure. Hi. My background's in local economic development in the north of England, in Yorkshire. I was heavily involved in business-linked networks and European funding. I'm showing my age a bit there. And got involved in social enterprise and social value perhaps a little bit before you, Adrian, when we were setting up in Yorkshire a large social enterprise development network. And if you knew how to fill in the forms at the time, and you wrote down social enterprises add value, the public money flowed easily. I'm back 10 years or more now. Until quite rightly, a funder turned around in a meeting and said, this added value you keep banging on about. You've had £4 or £5 million worth of public money now in a few years, you must have added a lot of value. Where is it? And to cut a long story short, went back to the office and said, right, how do we answer that question? Got involved in SROI, firstly with social enterprises. How do they answer that question? We know what the enterprise bit is, cash flow forecast, business plan. Where's the social bit of that? Find success that you can share with others, that you can ask someone to take a risk against and invest. And that grew into, we're just coming up for the 10th anniversary of the SROI network, now called Social Value UK, which I was heavily involved in. And been having these arguments and these conversations about what is it and how much have you done and how we share it, report it. I'm always a bit dubious of that word, Adrian, prove. Much prefer the improve of the prove and the improve strapline.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of social value, obviously it gets talked about a lot all the time. And then there's this thing about there's not that many organisations that actually measure their social value. So as much as people would love to do it, how do they get started, and what, you know, why don't more people do it? Perhaps why is there confusion around measuring social value?
Oh, how long have we got?
Well, you've got about 40 minutes.
This is like one of those, like when you're at school and you get set an essay question, you have 40 minutes to answer the following discourse. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you kind of go, but people have written 3-volume novels about that stuff.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, this is the subject of conferences, many conferences now, 4 years, and you want it all in 38 minutes now.
Yeah,
right,
so we want to get as much of your expertise out of your brains as we can. So I've gone straight in with the killer question.
Then you can download it.
We've gone for the killer question straight away.
Okay, well, I've got a few ideas around this about why there is the confusion. I think a lot of it is to do with hype, and some of it is to do with forgetfulness. So the forgetfulness is when we talk about reporting, capturing, understanding the impact or the changes that we're making. This is nothing new. There have been documented historical references to enterprises doing this, get ready for this, since the middle of the 19th century. 170 years ago, impact reporting, value capture was being done by enterprises of the day. We just forgot. It just got swept over and it didn't work through. We also have, I think, the challenge of the hype. So I think social return on investment is a useful tool in some regards. I think though it's quite dangerous in the hype that surrounds it. It was originally developed as a tool in America by a homeless charity to help elicit more corporate donor support and donations. New Economics Foundation imported it to the UK, got a couple of MPs very interested in the concept of it, and then all of a sudden it's become something else, which it wasn't originally designed necessarily to do, but we haven't fundamentally shifted the way that we present the framework and the model and argue for it. And I think the other challenge that we have as well, in terms of this idea of forgetfulness, very often we talk about value and impact reporting in a similar way that we would prepare a set of accounts. And Tim's already mentioned this. You know, we talk about the enterprise, it's simple. Here's the financial accounts, here's the business plan, we've got to do a social thing. Here's the question, a bonus for your starter for 10 audience. How many years did it take us globally to get an agreement about what financial accounting standards should be?
We haven't agreed yet, Adrian.
Exactly. So I think those are some of the wider contextual stuff as to why there is all this confusion about groups saying, oh, it should be this, it should be that. We're still in the kind of the melting pot, and we're not telling enough of the stories about those early days. And like Tim's mentioned, the impact of European funding in starting to drive this agenda, or resurgence of the agenda, the political interests from policymakers and government. And then ultimately, I think there's also a legal aspect as well that I don't hear talked about enough, which is about basic legal compliance. So for example, most people are aware that as a charity, if you are any of the 3 legal forms of charity in the UK, there's no requirement to do public benefit reporting. So simply saying we offer some bursaries is not enough. You must show what benefit, what value, what added goodness does that create. We have a similar thing if you are a community interest company. If you are a society, a cooperative society or a community benefit society, the FCA are now saying you must show how what you are doing adds to community benefit, and if you don't, we take away your status. And here's the thing that most people forget. As a company, as a limited company of any type, PLC, guarantee, share, whatever, since about 2010, it's been the law that says company directors are supposed to report every year on the impact they're having on their customers, the environment, the community, and so it goes. So, but there's all these reasons, and as Tim says, there's all these conferences going on, there's all these different agendas and players, and how do we, as a small enterprise at the start of this, get our head around where do we start?
Yeah. So Tim, is it all just hype? These 70, 80, 100 different methods, should we just say forget them all and pick one?
If you can get that down to a list of 70 or 80 for me, Heidi, that would be great. Inspiring Impact it's often quoted a work a few years ago with 120 organisations to see the tools and approaches they were using to measure social value, looking to find a consistent or a few top runners in there. In 120 organisations, they found 130 different approaches. The London Stock Exchange will host tomorrow a launch of a new reporting hub for corporates. And I had a sneak peek at it today, just to rummage through it. But that's got 2,300 different, they've called them reporting requirements and approaches for companies that they've managed to collect together. Now, the purpose of bringing them together is to start to look for convergence, commonalities, and that's great. But the fact that there's so many and no evidence that that number's going down, I think it's going up at the moment. That shows us a couple of things. I think that we're interested in it, we're driving it. Social value is on the increase and on the agenda. There is no consistency, therefore comparability, until we have the whole question of standards. One of the things SROI is quite keen on and promoting is standards and consistency. But unless we all agree on things to standardise, there is no convergence. We have the Social Value Act, we have all the things Adrian's outlined that regardless of your constitution, organisation should be doing anyway. I think when those things aren't even being picked up, I think we've got some way to go before we're going to have a right or wrong, recognised standard way of doing it. I think it would be a big step forward. But that's, I think, a different debate from what do you do as an organisation now to start. How do you find your way through this maze? And I think the maze is going to get bigger, it's getting more complex, it's more nuanced. And for those of us that are in it, that's all very interesting and exciting. When you have a basic business need to understand, demonstrate, and I would say the most important thing, grow the social value, it's not as clear on how you could do with financial value.
So, because of all this confusion and all these different methods, what would you, when you say start, where would you start? We've talked about proving and improving.
Yeah.
So would you say to an organisation, start to prove what you've done, or think about how you can improve first, or do both together?
Really annoying, and I'd actually take a step back from that before I even started, and I'll explain why. I think the first thing, and number one for me, is be clear on your definition and be honest with yourself to begin with, and then others, as to what your definition of social value is. And I think half the problem with the proliferation of methods and approaches and the Social Value Act and stuff that's out there is that we haven't agreed a definition, and there are a number of possible challenges in different ways into that. It would be a lot more helpful if we are clear. I think the simplest list is around motivation and who, amongst the different stakeholder groups within an organisation, defines social value and has a right to. Is it your social aims or charitable aims? Is it your funding requirements? Or is it your service users who define your social value?
I think there's another group within that in terms of defining social value, Tim, and that's your customers. Because what I'm seeing is a lot of enterprises increasingly using their social value as a point of differentiation in the marketplace, particularly in business to business and the retail marketplace.
And there's another subset in there as well of, I think, staff and volunteers. We tend to ignore these definitions and just assume that a definition of doing good or social value that we have, increasing someone's well-being or health or it's exercising more, is good, right? Let's do more of it. Let's build a structure around it. Off we go. Ignoring that there might be a conflict in those definitions. External relationship between a funder and your needs for PR will conflict with the internal ones of improvement, if you're really honest with yourself. And I think then all the challenges of what's right for me, how do I measure it, let alone say if you actually get onto SROI and a numbers game, all the way back to your motivations, because we're not clear, firstly, on the question of why we're measuring it. And if you just step back and think about those and look at some of the discussion around it, is there any evidence that having a figure or a good narrative of your social value makes any difference to funders? I think narrative, yes. The figure, the social return on investment or a ratio, no evidence of that, I don't think. And the more serious the funder, the less likely they are to actually be able to take that figure into account, and the more you're going to be motivated to inflate it, and so they can't take it into account. And
I've come across lots of examples, Tim, of that happening in practice where I'm working with clients and they say, we commissioned a consultant to do an SROI report on ourselves. And I go, brilliant. Why? Because our funder asked for one. And so I go back to the funder and I say, why did you ask for this? Oh, because we thought we should. What have you done with it?
Yes.
Nothing.
And I think it's very, there's a very similar story to be told in social investment, that investors want to see some answer to the question, how are you measuring your social impact? They don't know what to do with that answer. And I think in both areas, there is no discernment of depth or judgment or the quality of the work that's gone into it. You just have to have something. You have to be able to answer the question. And I think there are challenges there that mean, at the moment, regardless of the quality of your account of social value, it's probably not being taken into account in funding decisions because of all these challenges, because there's no standards, because there's no definition, because there's no discernment of the quality of it and whether it was a good one or not. You just have to have something. So you're not going to get that far with it if your motivation is funding or investment solely. I think the other external one of PR, well, why do we want to promote ourselves and have PR? It's ultimately to get funding and investment. So I kind of put those two in the same box. Conflict then is between the desire to have a big number and show something there to promote yourselves to attract resources with the internal bit. How do we, and this is the prove, and it's always prove and improve. I think of them as prove versus improve. And part of this being honest with yourself, and do it with yourself first as to what your business model and your definition is, but then move that, if you can, onto being transparent with customers and stakeholders about the conflict between those internal and external agendas. How do you improve? It's not from identifying and claiming positive intended things that you do for people who will pay for them. We already know about those. We're probably measuring those. We improve, we learn the most from negatives, from mistakes. Now, you may choose to control those internally. You may be really brave and transparent and take those externally. And there's lots of stories in the public and the private world of people who are starting to do that. You'll see increasingly in corporate reporting. Negatives, being reported because it proves you're aware and you're managing them. I think it's a completely different motivation that then leads to a completely different account of your social value if you're using it to improve. How are you going to improve your social value? We won't do any of that if we don't measure it, and then we get on to how to measure it. That goes full circle. That won't make any sense at all if you're not clear on what you're measuring. Whose value, why are you doing it, and then you come up with something that is fit for purpose, and we'll do some good. I love the old adage of weighing a pig doesn't make it any fatter. I think there's an awful lot of SROIs there that are just a pig sitting on some scales, and funders and audiences and investors looking at it going, and what's your point? Where is it a year later? Has it gone up? Has it gone down? But no. Why did you do it then?
Heidi, I concur with everything Tim says there. I think though, the way that I tend to approach it, my approach as an alternative perspective with clients and groups who are asking this, are lots of 5-word questions, which potentially summarize everything Tim's just said in 2 short sentences. The first lot of 5 words.
Hang on, slow down. Let me write this down, Adrian.
What's the point of you? So what's the point of you being here? Why you? Why not someone else? And the second 5-word questions, what do you already measure? Yeah. Because I think there is this concern that groups say, once we've defined what it is that we're about and why we are valuable and on our terms, and we know the reasons for doing that, there's then this disconnect that says, oh, but it's going to be too much work, too hard. How do we resource this? How do we do it? So next bit is, well, actually, if you say having a concern about the environment, you know, the natural environment is important to you as one of your values as an organization, then let's look at what you already capture. So let's look at your energy bills, so we can work at your carbon footprint. Let's look at your supply chain, who's local. Let's look at your staff, travel expenses. Are you using lots of private cars, or are you using public transport? There's lots of things we can very quickly start to capture and measure just through a different lens. And that, as goes back to what Tim said, it starts to create that encouragement and that cycle that says, yeah, let's start to get more excited and more reassured that we can do this on our terms, not somebody else's, because anything we do for somebody else will never stick.
Definitely. One of the things that I've seen is quite a lot of organisations try to measure relatively short-term interventions and make them into big outcomes. So they might run an event or a couple of workshops or something and try to claim that that's created an enormous amount of change and difference to the individuals they've worked with. And part of that is because they feel they're forced to by the external community, like you're saying about, you know, inflating their social value and proving that these things are worthwhile. But actually, they probably would be better off just doing something around, was it a good session, or did you enjoy the workshop, and getting some feedback. So how do you approach those kind of conversations with clients that you're working with, where they think a very short-term intervention has had a lasting change on people, or maybe you haven't come across that?
I think the challenge, Heidi, is somewhere in between the 2 extremes you're describing. So someone who counts the number of people who came to a session is completely missing the impact. But yet, surprisingly, this happens on some very big scales in social investment. You know, number of interventions, number of lives touched. How? In what way? The other end of that you've changed someone's life as a result of a 45-minute video that they watched on a social enterprise conference, it's unlikely. I think there are things in those kind of interventions where you enable someone to think differently. They've considered something new. They might not have learnt a new skill that is going to have any evidence in. What is the first step in what might be a longer journey that you've enabled them to do? Someone thinking differently? Have they got a new area to explore? And don't go and claim the destination of that journey, that someone watching a 45-minute video that we're now going to claim that they became the Nobel Peace Prize winner. I think you can capture...
Well, you're not. I am.
Well, you're going to claim it, or you're the
Nobel
Nobel
Peace Prize winner? Who's going to argue it? Who's going to contest it? And that's an important point, contestability. We talk about attribution, never contestability. No, who here knows of anyone who did a social impact, social value report and had it publicly challenged, other than Liam Black picking on me on Twitter?
Well, I mean, going back to the start, this is one of the benefits of social return on investment, as in that it does have a verification, external verification element to it, and it's one of the 7 principles. And you go and look at the 2,300 reporting requirements in sustainability reporting, or the 130 odd things that these 120 organizations were doing that inspiring impact found. How many of them have external verification? Now, there's a whole separate debate around that. I think there's a fundamental point there, Adrian, that you can inflate your number, claim what you like, and who's going to do anything about it? So I'll claim that one for SROI. At any rate, going back to your question, Heidi, before I was so rudely interrupted. I think a short-term intervention can produce short-term outcomes. So don't just measure the outputs, but don't claim the long-term outcomes. Yeah. Make it credible. Otherwise it just goes on the pile with all these other incredible claims of social value. And if we really want to be noticed, we've got to get on to the point where we all claim all the jobs of all the people that we've touched during a year. Because all of these things in the public sector will stack up at Treasury, who go, fantastic, there's clearly no unemployment or skills gap in the country anymore if I add up all the jobs that have been created and qualifications this year, according to these accounts. It's incredible, therefore all put in the not credible pile, ignored, and we're back to square one about proving something. And our motivations for doing it results in a useless account that isn't used by anyone to make any of the decisions that we're trying to influence.
I might risk disagreeing on this. I think there can be a case for a short-term intervention to have wider impacts attributed to it or claimed against it. It comes back to Tim's early point. What's the point? Why are you doing this? Why do you want to claim these wider impacts? If it's because you're trying to showcase a new model, if it's because you're trying to lobby for support better, you're trying to influence commissioners, fine, just be clear. There is a framework some people may have come across called cost-benefit analysis, rediscovered, repopularised by New Economy Manchester, DCLG and the Treasury recently, which says you work out your model. So this is what your service does as a relatively short-term effect. But then don't just measure it on your terms. Go out there, look around the wide world and say, who else in the course of recorded documented history has done something similar and then tracked longitudinal changes in a way that's been expertly and independently verified, so it fits with the principles again. And on that basis, there is a causation you can tenuously argue, which does start to say, because we did it this way here, we think these things have happened, on the basis that everyone else around the world who did a similar thing, when they did those longitudinal, peer-reviewed expert studies, it worked as well. As Tim said, it's a tenuous link, it's a risky proposition, but I think there can be circumstances where it's useful. It's a model that government use all the time. But again, as I said, it's not a new model. This cost-benefit analysis is based on a French economist's model at the end of the 18th century. And I think, like Tim said, there's hundreds and thousands of frameworks and measures and tools out there, and it's about being clear, why are you wanting to measure this? Why are you wanting to capture the value? And then finding the best fit of those tools in the context of your resources and your values.
Isn't social return on investment, or SROI, contentious then, because that's based on a lot of assumptions, and there's the same kind of cause and effect kind of principles apply to that in terms of you make a number of assumptions when you do the calculations. So are we saying now that these assumptions are okay to make, or should we?
I think it's Tim's point about transparency and saying this is why we think it's a good thing, because within the context of SROI, we spoke to these groups. These groups of people said, yes, we feel it's because of Heidi's the online festival webinar that we've become a Nobel Prize winner. Then we can claim the attribution. In the same way that if an auditor comes in and looks at your financial accounts, they say, yes, we think on the basis that you've shown us these things in this order, this is the right number. But it is a kind of a big thing. So just as a prop, because I brought some props with me today, I see Tim's got a whole bookcase of props behind him. I'm just in a plain white room. So I brought with me...
it was a sell, Adrian.
I've got one of those over there. Shall I get mine as well?
All 100 pages of it.
Still grab them. Yeah.
Now mine still has a virgin copy of the map as well.
Wow. Those are collectible now.
You never even used it then.
It's understanding tools. Yeah, because again, if we read up, if we properly understand the SROI methodology, for example, it puts all these warnings in, and it says there will have to be caveats. There is dead weighting and discounting. Be honest and clear about it. The challenge is, as you've picked up, Heidi, and Tim's also clarified with a lot more detail and contextualized, people overclaim, and no one challenges on that because no one knows how to, because we've yet to define some core principles in terms of how they can be universally applied.
Mm-hmm. So is the next step then to have some comparability and benchmarking? Do you think that's something that's going to happen? Because it's something that a lot of organisations do ask, you know, how do we compare to other organisations that do similar work or services? But actually there's no way of doing that kind of comparison
but there
easily.
Is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, actually, no, there is. I think there is.
Okay.
I took the lead last time, Tim. Do you want to go first this time?
Yeah. There's certainly a need for it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's plenty of attempts to find ways of doing it. Benchmarkings, assurance, verification, audits, all of these kind of words used, and SRI has a lot to say in that space. And personally, I think a good answer to that question. I think its purpose is in comparability for making investment decisions, consistency in reporting so that audiences know what they're looking at and how to read it. And for those purposes, definitely needed. Don't confuse that with the only way to do it and a standardized set of outcomes and values and some kind of calculator that standardizes the approach. Then you're going to miss completely the point about your purpose. Your purpose will almost certainly and should be unique. And so the approach to measuring and defining and understanding it is not going to lend itself to a standard approach. So again, it's understanding these different internal and external business needs. If we want to influence policy and marketplaces, we've got to do it in a way that policies, society and marketplaces can recognize it. How's that happen with financial accounting? Financial standards, verification, audit. And right or wrong, we know what a balance sheet and the finance pages of an annual report looks like. It's a sanitized load of net figures. We use them to make decisions.
No, they're not sanitized.
Oh, Adrian, talk to a financial director.
All the time. It's just once you know the numbers,
we are not getting into discussing financial statements and accounts. Having trained as a chartered accountant nearly 20 years ago, I think the conversations about whether accounts tell you the right information or the wrong information, whether the standard is right, how they're changing it this year is appropriate, etc., and how we can get to international accounting standards that then have different countries applying different versions to that. Let's not go there.
I think it does touch upon an interesting point about these comparisons between financial accounting and value accounting. My second prop of the day, this goes back a bit further. Social Accounting and Audit Network. Social
I've got that as well. Shall I get mine?
Well, I don't think my camera's going to be big enough to kind of fit this all in, because it's quite. This is the process in a nutshell.
All you're proving, Adrian.
Where's it gone?
All you're proving is that you've never used these resources.
Yeah.
Mine looks a bit more worn out than that.
Exactly.
It's pre-loved. But it's this bit here which kind of looks at the process of financial accounting and audit against the stages of thinking about how you capture and identify your value. So I think there's a lot to be said about financial and social going hand in hand. And I did some work back in the late 90s, actually, with a law firm. And they were looking at how you can developed an approach to environmental impact reporting that mirrored your financial accounts. Very little uptake at the time because no one saw the business case for it. But just to come back to this question, Heidi, about how do we compare our approaches with others? Where's those commonalities? I think there is an easy approach. Inevitably, there's lots of good stuff out there which gets lost in the melee because there's so much noise. As Tim said, all those thousands of measures. What we do seem to have an emerging consensus about are the principles to approach this through. And, as Tim's kind of touched upon some of those already. Now, Social Value UK have developed a benchmarking toolkit based around the approach principles, which say, in terms of these, not necessarily the way you do it, but the way you approach doing it. Now, as a benchmarking tool, it's quite fun because it gives you a nice little pie chart at the end with coloured wedges, a bit like Trivial Pursuit. But for me, the bit that I get really excited about is that it then gives you the option to benchmark. So you say, benchmark my results against organisations offering a similar service, or of a similar size, or of a similar age, or of a similar turnover, or of a similar sector. So we start to get a feel for, we can get some commonality then around, well, how are my peers approaching this? And how far ahead or behind might I be? I think in terms of the idea about how do we make sense, though, of comparing like for like, the measures within it, and this is something that I've struggled with within the way that I approach my own kind of value reporting. One of my measures that I started with 11 years ago was how much am I investing back in my own professional practice? And I needed to think about how do I get a measure which will be consistent over time. And if I kind of say, well, the number of days I spend on going on training courses, well, I could go on a training course which is about knitting yarn because I think it's interesting, but it makes no difference on my business practice. Then do I do it on the basis of, do I then include the days I spend reading journals? But those could be the crosswords in them. So the meaningful measure for me was about cash. And it comes back to, again, this idea, there has to be a business case for it. Otherwise, why are we doing it? So for me, it's about what percentage of my turnover of my business am I spending on CPD as a cash amount? Now, unfortunately, there are no published benchmarks about what people who are freelancers spend on their CPD. No one's tracking this, it's too messy. What I've done then is to cobble together a benchmark using statistics from the Chartered Institute of Professional Development, which says this is the typical amount as a percent. Now, all they've got is this is the percentage of wage that we pay against an employee training, but then against the National Audit Office, what's an average salary then? So all the information's out there to create those comparisons. We just need to maybe be a bit more imaginative and say, well, and it goes back to Tim's point, rather than be led by other people and their standards and agendas, let's actually say, well, let's do this on our terms and let's have some fun with it and be creative with it. And why don't we do that? And so that's what I did last year, along with some other comparisons, put it out, and no one's come back to contest it. And if anything, people have come back and said, that's a really sensible approach to doing it. And to me, it says, well, okay, so why aren't we doing more of this? And maybe it's because there's so much confusion and noise out there at the moment.
Or maybe people aren't doing it because they think actually they'll get criticised for creating these benchmarks, but actually, as you both said, no one ever, or very rarely ever, criticises anything that's put in a social value or social return on investment report. So actually, it's time people could experiment and make some of these benchmarks and see what happens, really. Start doing something. Don't just keep sitting there. Do anything. Start. Get momentum. Brilliant. So it's been really interesting talking to both of you today. In terms of just wrapping up, have you got any top tips that you would give to social enterprises and social entrepreneurs obviously, Adrian, you've just mentioned there, start doing something. Any other ones that you'd want to add?
Okay, so maybe just a couple more to leave you with. Get a really good bullshit detector. Okay, there's a lot of hype and spin out there. Find a way to cut through it, get some reference points. The second is that in the end, ultimately, we're going to be remembered as stories. We're not going to, like Tim says, we're not going to be remembered for the numbers and the statistics. It's going to be the stories that people tell about us that will be what we're remembered by. So use storytelling in those sorts of approaches. And finally, Tim mentioned there's a lot of conferences out there about social value, things going on. Try and get to all of them, as many as you can, not necessarily to pick up the tools and the approaches, but to steal as many new office supplies as you can. Make your own money go further.
Okay, thank you,
to
Tim.
get lots of nice materials that you can show you've never used in webinars.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Tim, any tips that you'd want to share?
Yeah, okay, let's see if I can get 3 like Adrian then. When I started with, be honest. Honest with yourself about why you're doing it, and if you can, take that further to other stakeholders as your motivation's doing it. And the most important of that for me is defining your social value and acknowledging conflict between the internal and external uses of social value. Be confident in those stories that Adrian's talking about. Secondly, not the number. We got sidetracked on financial value. An accountant, Heidi, you can, what word shall I use? Massage numbers, not too far.
Creatively express.
Apply the accounting standards in a different way.
Right. No auditor ever writes across your accounts that number is right.
No, because there isn't a right number. If
true and fair, and numbers are within a range, it can be categorised in different ways, and we've learned to be comfortable with that. So don't try to even come up with a social value figure that is a right number that everyone else is going to agree with. And that comfort or confidence that we get from precision is completely false. No one else will get it, and it doesn't bring the credibility with it. Be confident in the principles that you've listened to people about what's important to them, and then measured whether you're doing any of that in order to do more of it. So that would be my third one. Grow it because you're confident, and it stacks up in a journey. You grow it, and that pig sitting on the scales. Well, we're not going to grow it if we don't measure it, and we're not going to manage it if we don't measure it. Let's be clear, firstly, what it is. So, be honest, get confidence from the story and the principles, not numbers, and then measure it, grow it.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you both very much for joining us today. It's been really good talking to you. If anyone wants to get in touch with Adrian or Tim, their details will be underneath the video. So you can get in touch with them and ask them any more questions, or alternatively just find out when the next social value conference is coming up, so that you can meet them face to face. Yeah, there's one in November. So all right, so thank you both very much for joining me today. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, Heidi.
Bye.